wild as this BC Firenado is, you've seen one before. And you've seen the kind of punishing winds Typhoon Mangkhut dealt to the Philippines and China, as well as the deluge Hurricane Florence brought to North Carolina. These extreme weather events happen so often, they're described as a new normal, but we're slowly starting to measure what that normal means. Take last year's forest fire season in BC. One estimate found that in the Lower Mainland, hospital visits and emergency calls for heat and smoke-related problems were up 20 to 50% compared to a decade ago. If that doesn't take your breath away, your future insurance bill might. The cost of protecting against catastrophic fires and floods is also up. For more than 3 decades, property and casualty losses averaged just over $400 million a year. But since 2009, it shot up to $1.8 billion. This isn't a costly future, it's an expensive right now. So tonight we're asking, how do we live with extreme weather? So lots to unpack here, and to help us with that in Toronto, Blair Feltmate, a professor from the Faculty of Environment at the University of Waterloo, and in Vancouver, our CBC News meteorologist, Johanna Wagstaffe. And Joe, let me start with you. You know the question, it comes up all the time, particularly in the last few months. This extreme weather, to what extent is it the result of climate change?
Well, Ian, you're right. I do get this question all the time as a meteorologist. And for many years, my answer was that we can't connect one extreme weather event to climate change. But recently, I've changed my answer to just yes. Every single extreme weather event is connected to a warming climate, because as our baseline shifts up, as that changes and shifts our seasons, as we see longer and hotter summers, we see more moisture being held in our atmosphere, we see higher water levels, that means every single event is being amplified by climate change.
And so, Blair, that's an interesting shift for Johanna in her analysis. What about for you?
No, I agree totally. So all the modeling on climate change that's been done over the last many years by groups like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a group of several hundred climate scientists that all they do 7 days a week is study climate science. Their predictions are that, yes, climate change has happened, is happening, will continue to happen, and we're seeing the expression of extreme weather events as a result of that.
So tonight and throughout the week, we've been covering 2 devastating storms, the typhoon in the Philippines and then moving on to South China, and the hurricane in the Carolinas. Take a look at this.
I'm Paul Hunter in Wilmington, North Carolina, where people are out and about today kind of assessing the mess left behind by Florence and starting the repair and the rebuild, not least the power grid. At almost every corner in this city, you see downed power lines. That one's inactive, by the way. On top of what we've been talking about for days now, which is the toppled trees, which brought down the power lines, which knocked out the power for so much of this city, and the rebuild in many places. You're seeing a lot of this today. Workers finally out because there's a break in the weather again to start the repair and the rebuild of so many structures damaged, if not destroyed, by Florence. In a sense, now the hard part begins.
Yeah, rebuilding, Johanna, is the hard part. It's expensive. It takes a lot of time. And then there's the issue of rethinking maybe how some of these communities should be rebuilt after storms.
It's true, and I'm always surprised talking to city planners, people who make decisions about building codes, engineers, that this is a question that people are thinking about now. Climate change and climate change models are coming, up in conversation when talking about how to move our cities forward. But the big question is, are we willing to invest in these changes now? We're talking dramatic and drastic changes to our cities, especially coastal cities, in a short amount of time, and that's going to take a lot of money. So yes, we're thinking about it, but the question is, will these changes happen too late?
And Blair, the rebuilding, especially rebuilding differently, is something I know you've taken a close look at. What are you seeing?
Well, what we're doing in Canada right now, we're actually changing the building codes or developing new building codes at the level of the individual house. We've developed a code that's actually come out through the Canadian Standards Association in the last couple of months that gives direction on aspects of what you can do around your own home to not end up with a flooded basement. And we're developing another standard right now in Canada on flood resilience for new community design. How do we build new communities going forward such that when the big storms hit, everybody doesn't get flooded out? And then for existing communities, we're developing another code right now. How do we use berms, diversion channels, holding ponds, cisterns, bioswales, et cetera, within currently built cities to help lower the flood risk profile.
So this is a challenge, obviously, for communities, and as you say, a lot of communities are responding to this. On a more micro level, how do we prepare for events like this?
If it's down to the individual homeowner by micro level, there are things you should do around your house to prepare. And by the way, it starts with find out today or tomorrow morning, what are you covered for in reference to insurance? Most people, the first time they look into whether or not they have insurance for water in the basement is when they have 4 feet of sewer water in the basement. So number one, call your broker right up front and find out what you're covered for and what you're not covered for. But even around your house, there are simple things as simple as disconnecting the downspout from the eaves trough system. If it goes into the ground, into the weeping tile system, cut that off, put an elbow on direct water 3 meters away from the foundation. Put plastic covers over window wells to make it such when the big storms hit, the water doesn't fill the window well and fill your basement. And if you have a sub pump, make sure you have battery backup supply for your sub pump, because the time you need the sub pump is when the big storms hit, and that's when the electricity goes out.
Johanna, you spent so much time over the last few years talking about these big weather events as they're happening, after they happen. What's your sense in terms of how well prepared we are?
Well, Blair brought up a good point. I think as individuals, we have a responsibility to figure out what extreme weather we're most vulnerable to, because that's different for every part of Canada. But I think that on a bigger scale, we have a problem when it comes to preparing for the future when it comes to climate change, because the concept of new normal is changing. And I'm sort of pleased to hear media and people use this term new normal in the past couple of years when we're talking about climate change, but in a way that that term doesn't really work, because the extremes that we're seeing now might be our new normals down the road, but that means we're going to have much more extremes. So the new normals are shifting. We haven't reached an equilibrium yet, and we're not even sure what that new equilibrium looks like. We just know that it's going to actually be far more extreme than what we're seeing now.
And, you know, I wonder at what point fatigue may set in for people who are consuming news, right? Because right now we can talk about this is going to be the storm of the century. These flood projections are the worst that this place has seen in a long time. What if it's no worse than it was 2 years ago, but 2 years ago was really bad? But anyway, we're seeing lots of big weather events. And Blair, what have we learned from these past events?
Well, one of the things we're learning now with repeated flooding is the #1 cost in Canada, by the way, due to climate change, is that the magnitude of the storms is increasing. And we're learning that the weather of the past is not a predictor of the weather of the future. So if someone's lived in a particular area and said, I've lived here for 30 years and I've never seen any real threat of flooding and so forth, and then all of a sudden they're flooded out, that's because the actual dynamic of the system has changed. We've changed the chemistry of the atmosphere through the burning of fossil fuels, and now we're getting different weather regimes as a result of that. And by the way, we're not going backwards on climate change. Climate change is irreversible. It's here to stay. So we can slow down the rate of change, but we can't stop it.
Last words to each of you. Johanna, first of all, I know, you're a public figure. A lot of people engage with you online and in person. And you've heard, I think, a bit of a shift when it comes to interactions and people making reference to climate change.
Yeah, I have. And I think, I'm cautiously optimistic about that. But I really have seen this tipping point just in the past couple of years, really, across our national audience. And unfortunately, I do think a lot of times it takes an event that hits home. For example, these past 2 fire seasons, back-to-back historic fire seasons in BC. And for the first time, I'm getting more feedback and comments and engagement from people wanting to know more about climate change or wanting to know the connection to climate change rather than people straight up denying it. And for me, that is a huge shift. And so I hope that's the start of a tipping point. The question will be connecting that shift in believing and talking about climate change to actually taking climate action. And that question will be, will it happen too little, too late?
And Blair, you talked earlier about knowing, for example, what's in your insurance policy. That is really good advice. Any last piece of advice for people?
Well, the bottom line is, for the country as a whole, as a matter of fact, is time is not a luxury when it comes to climate change. Every day we don't adapt is a day we don't have. So we have to operationalize on adaptation to climate change, and we have to do so very rapidly.
Well, I like the fact that both of you have strong words, but not hopelessness, which is, nice to hear that there are things that we can do to adapt. Thanks to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.